Cortex box, apparently, since 1995 has had this feature. And if you're actually physically located, you can press and hold the program button and enter 072, and that allows you remote control. So now you can dial in from anywhere, and you can go in and set things as you wish. Again, how convenient that they're using standard POTS or plain old telephone. So you can, I guess once you set that up for yourself as an attacker, you could come back and make changes, add in key codes, right? So you could get in without anyone noticing. All right, number 4, silent keys, which is basically just picking the lock. But the difference here is that when you pick the lock, there's a postman key, first of all. And the postman key can be programmed so that it only allows them into a specific, well, the mail area. You have the man trap, essentially, so they come in the first door, the mailboxes are there, but they can't get in the second door. My study, again, I did a very limited look, but my study found that nobody bothers to set up the 2 doors because it involves different relays, it involves different wires, much easier to just pull everything back, plug it in, right? Save money. So the postman comes in and it buzzes, and usually he or she doesn't know if they're getting into both doors or one door. Sometimes they can tell, I suppose, but what I found is that very rarely are they set up properly. And the control relay, this is going to be key later, the control relay is known to be just a simple way of, when they put their key in and they turn it, it just sends a signal. It basically jumps 2 pieces of metal, and then boom, they're inside the building. The auxiliary is the same concept. You might have seen buttons that you have to punch to get out of a building, sometimes magnets. You have to touch the magnet, so it has to be like an actual person's hand. Same thing. So you can wire in those, and then you can have an override. Both of these exploits are very easy, obviously, to interface with. Like you pull apart that button, or you get something else that would be able to give you access somewhere else. You could run wires, you could splice, and you could run it somewhere else and push that button on the outside, for example. So the postman and the auxiliary give you quite a few options if you want to do some wiring or you want to do a pick. You want to pick the lock. Okay, so number 5. This is really what the presentation boils down to. So there was an epidemic of break-ins in San Francisco, well, all over the city, of course. And this map, which you see on the right, is an actual topographical chart of crime, which some guys did. I keep a blog, and I wrote about this a while back, but that stuff over on the right that's really tall is the highest amount of crime. So you have vandalism and assaults, right, narcotics in certain parts of town. So there was this big epidemic, not in that mountainous part, but actually a little bit over where it's sort of a valley, we're kind of flat. And 2 people were arrested in March of this year, and they apparently had been running a circuit for 6 to 8 months at least. So when the police busted them, and they busted them based on fingerprints, because they left their fingerprints at a scene of a crime, and there was a surveillance camera. So they had a suspect who was this Gandhi person, ironically, and they went and they found 5 truckloads of stuff in this apartment. So it took them 5 full police giant, semi-trucks to clean out the apartment of stolen goods. And it sort of started people wondering, like, how are they getting into all these places? Because there was a rash of break-ins, broken windows and stuff. There were a lot of empty buildings they were going into, but there were also a lot of reports of people getting stuff stolen almost in broad daylight or at random times with no damage to the buildings, right? Stuff was just getting, like, lifted right out of the hallways. And this is where a manager of a building contacted me, because they had stuff on the walls in their sort of interior space that was just being taken. So art, mirrors, furniture, anything in the secure garages, all this stuff was disappearing. Yet there was no evidence of any break-in, right? Nobody could figure out how they were coming in and where they were going. So one day when they contacted me, they said, now our box is broken too. It's like it's not even working. They must have messed with it. The postman can't get in, our mail's not getting delivered. So I went and took a look, and I noticed, I don't know if you can see this, I tried to make it really clear, but at the top, you see my hand there? Yeah, so the top, there's a little tiny lip that's been bent up, just strategically placed right above that key lock. If you notice in the lower left, there's the postman key too, right? They have their own separate key, very secure looking. But at the top, there's that just tiny little lip. So you start to ask, like, how vandal resistant is this? Look how thin that metal is, right? That's like tiny, like 32nd of an inch. So I did a quick assessment just by looking at it, by taking it with my hand and opening it, and I was like, wow, this has a single lever. Like the key that you turn sometimes puts bolts through the side, right? You turn the key and it has 2 bolts that go through holes, for example, so it has much more resistance. This has a tiny little finger basically that moves up and down. So by prying that up, you're prying 1/8 of an inch maybe or less. You could do it with your key, you could do it with your screwdriver. So that was the first problem I noticed. Very thin construction on a lot of these boxes. And I started walking around and looking at other boxes. And again, I wasn't doing an assessment, but I just wanted to know, is this typical? And pretty much, yeah. A lot of them have this very thin metal box. I don't think it would matter if it was flush, because you'd still be able to pry in some cases to get in. It matters how that lock is configured, like how that lip is, how much purchase it gets when it's locked. And so the second thing I noticed here is that it was closed, but it was unlocked. So this was in an unlocked state like this, with the lock actually turned to a locked state. And that's because they had bent it just enough so you could take your hand and pull, and it was just barely touching it. So the resistance, in other words, somebody could walk up to this at any time of day and just sort of pry it open. And that really matters. This is what it looks like when you open it, because when you pop it open, it's just an empty box. It's ridiculous. There's no protection at all of the circuit board. And incidentally, this is how you replace, remember in the beginning I was talking about the paper? So if you want to be an apartment manager and people move in and move out and you're like, oh my God, I have to replace this, you're constantly opening this box and closing this box and looking at the circuit board. And what you see are cables, jumpers, and labels. So why are those important? Well, first of all, you can tell from cables, if you're familiar with circuit boards, if you've messed around with computers or you've messed around at all with any sort of electronics, you can tell what the cables essentially do. Some are meant to be pulled off, some are meant to be put on. Some connect circuit boards together, for example, so you know that's where the communication channels are going. It's just really easy to figure out what's going on in these boards because they're really simple. And the second is the jumpers. Well, that means there's signal that's being jumped, so you're obviously going to do something if you start jumping them manually instead of having the computer or have these things do it from a signal. And the labels, of course, will. You know, if it says touch here to break in. And that's exactly what it says. So this little arrow, you know, it's pointing here. I noticed the board has a little statement there. It's a little printed word. And at first I was like, wow, what does that say? And then I thought, does this really matter? Because when I looked at the board a little closer, I realized there aren't a lot of jumpers that I would mess with anyway. And I'm not going to tell you where all the faults are. I mean, you can figure it out yourself. But I'll point this one out because it's in the instructions I downloaded. I'll tell you that, right? So we already talked about the postal lock and how they have to get in and they turn their key and they get a signal. Well, on the board, it says postal lock, and it has a very simple jumper, like the most simple jumper you can imagine. Here's a highlight, right? You pull that guy off. It says postal lock. You pull that guy off and you touch it with anything metal. Yeah, so if you have a screwdriver and you want to break in one that's never been broken into, you pop it and touch it, and then you walk away. And it takes less than 10 seconds. I would say less than 5 seconds. If one's already been broken into, of course, you don't have to bring a screwdriver. You can just pry it open and use your key. Like, I'm going to open my door with my key and touch the postal lock. It doesn't have to fit the lock because it'll open up. And in this particular case, the reason that the system was broken and they asked me to look at it was because they had put that jumper back on incorrectly. So they pulled it off and put it back on to hide their tracks. And I found it in a way that was like just hanging off. I guess they're in a rush or something. But still, they're covering their tracks. And this goes back to my discussion earlier. That's why I bring up the risk. It's interesting to me that they were breaking in and stealing stuff that was just in the hallway, but they weren't actually breaking into the apartments. When I spoke to the police about this, they sort of said, oh yeah, shrugged their shoulders. You know, they didn't do real trespass. They just kind of like walked into the hallway, which I guess in prosecution, I guess if you're actually breaking the law, there's this whole concept of motive means an opportunity, and there's this whole concept of how people rationalize the motive aspect of it. I think some people who work with these systems on a regular basis, and I mean criminals by that, people who are breaking in, might actually see this as not breaking in. At some point they say, this thing is so easy to get into, I'm just walking in a public space and I'm taking what's just being left around by people. Almost like leaving stuff on the street, on the sidewalk. So you might see stuff outside on the sidewalk that's being dumped. They're looking inside your building and saying, well, you know, it's just protected by this keypad system. They must not really want to keep that. So here's what I downloaded off the web. You know, you can pull these for any one of I didn't put the full URL, but basically if you want to search for one, let's say you're looking at the Spectrum, so you would look for Centex/Spectrum and then some combination .pdf, and you will find the install guides, which all of the vendors that sell these will give you. And in this case, you can see right there, it says postal lock. It tells you where on the circuit board it is. So if you want to prep yourself, you know, you first figure out what the box is, then you download the circuit diagram, and then you know exactly, pop the box, go in, touch the postal lock, and you've entered the building. So, I'm moving a bit fast, but that leaves me with some opportunities. Obviously, the design of the box was the first thing that shocked me. When I saw how easy it was to break that lip open and just open the box and get in, I thought, well, you know, obviously we should get a bigger box for this thing. You know, people should be out there selling safe, you know, really thick boxes, safe quality boxes. But when I spoke to the guys that sell these things, they actually told me, no, 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 that's, we see this all the time. People break in these things. I guess you guys haven't been updated. And when they say updated, they don't mean like we're going to bring in a new unit that's been updated to be more tamper resistant, or something that doesn't have postal lock printed on it, or something that, I don't know, can't be programmed, doesn't have zeros for its default. They don't change any of that stuff. When they say updated, they mean they're going to bring in a drill and drill 3 big holes and then put in these giant permanent screws that have a fancy head on them, right? The security screws, designed by GM, now they have a pin in them. They change them every few years. So you need a fancy screwdriver, which when I thought about it at first, I was like, that doesn't make sense, because it defeats the whole purpose of the convenience. You no longer have a key to open, the manager's going to be there for 10 minutes. But when you think about it from the attacker perspective, if a minute is too long for them and they move on, that's all we need, right? And I know for a fact, actually, after this box was fixed, they put 3 screws in the top. On that very top lip, they literally just drilled a hole in 3 spots and then put these security screws in. They were really long, like 2 inches long, even though that metal was only, 1/32 of an inch or maybe 1/16 of an inch thick. So they put these screws in, and the building next door got broken into. It's pretty funny. So, there are a lot of famous security people that talk about that, how it's bad because you're just moving security. But when you think about it, that's kind of what you have to do, right? You just raise the bar enough, and then they break into something else. And that's right now what I see as the solution offered by these companies that know that there's a problem. All right, so another thing that's an opportunity here is to change the codes and regularly test. And these boxes are not set up to have their codes changed regularly. So there's definitely an opportunity for someone to come out with a box that has some programming language in it that has like expiration, for example, and requires you to update the codes. Maybe it has the ability to expire things that haven't been used in such a long time. So if no one's dialed an apartment or no one's dialed an office in 60 days or 360 days, something ridiculously high like that, well then erase it, right? Get rid of those codes. So there's a lot of opportunity in just how the interface is set up or how the programming is done on these boxes. And then the last one where I talked about upgrades, they don't really do it. That would be another opportunity. You could probably go to people and show them these exploits. For example, if you're selling boxes and you say, do you think that really is hard to get into? It's kind of sleazy, but at the same time, it would be good for the communities to know how bad they are. I don't think people realize how bad these are, managers and so forth. A flip side of that is if you talk to insurance companies about this, they're the ones who are paying out, especially when apartments are claiming on their manager's insurance. So they're going back and saying, I keep getting broken into, and they could say, well, what kind of box do you have? If the box isn't up to snuff, insurance companies could put some leverage on these guys to say, you're not upgrading them properly, you're not maintaining them properly. So I think there's a whole economics argument there as well. But I definitely encourage people to look at their boxes, figure out how old they are and how many people are moving in and out, whether the codes are changed, whether the thing can be opened up easily, so they have a better sense of what their true risk is, how vulnerable it is, and then how many threats there are in the neighborhood. So then I get into the more sophisticated opportunities. This is where I really get excited because I do a lot of this stuff. I've done video surveillance for a while for a lot of different reasons, and it's pretty interesting stuff. I'm a big fan of it as a detective control. I do not believe it's a very good preventive one. In fact, I've been asked to put up fake cameras with blinking lights and stuff like that, and I just say, find somebody else, because I don't believe in that philosophy. I think they can be preventive, like people can be deterred, but it's like locks can deter people, so you're just trying to keep the honest people out at that point, and that's not what they're good for. Like, you don't put locks on everything just to scare people. Like, you really are trying to prevent them with a lock. And with a camera, you're not really trying to prevent them. You're actually trying to detect stuff and look at it later. So the best way, in my opinion, to use these is to put opposing cameras up that would be looking at one of these boxes so you get a really clear view, and never look at the data unless the thing gets broken into, which of course requires you to know that you've been broken into, either by something being stolen or, as I talk about later, the tamper evidence. But the bottom line here is that the cameras, I think, are the real answer because these things are so weak. I don't think anyone's going to come out with a really cheap, really sophisticated, well, that's not entirely true. I mean, with Arduino and some other stuff, you could probably whip up a really cool system. But that being said, the cameras are really, really useful. And not just from the opposing ones that are looking at the people coming in the building. I've been doing a lot of stuff lately with trying to see who's using the box when they dial in. So then I started thinking, why not put a camera in the box? Do you see how big that box was? That circuit board is so small. Like, you could put a really nice camera inside the thing that just records who comes up and punches it. Simple opportunity to have something that's recording. Every time there's a signal, somebody's touching it, it would record their face. So wireless surveillance is another sort of freakish idea I had. I know for a fact that Bluetooth is being monitored and Macs are being monitored right now. So everywhere you go with Bluetooth, right, people are picking up your signal and tracking your whereabouts. So I started to think it's unlikely that attackers are going to come with any kind of Wi-Fi signal or radio signal, but they are generally wearing those earpieces. I don't know why, but I see a lot of these guys that walk, long black coats and they've got the earpieces. Not like profiling, but we did actually catch one of these dudes. And so I did get a profile of somebody who was part of this operation. But anyway, if you're profiling MAC addresses and then you have the timestamp of somebody getting into the building, a log maybe even